In 1953, the CIA launched an experiment so dark, it turned ordinary citizens into unknowing assassins. They called it Project MKUltra. The goal? Control the human mind. The result? Broken lives, erased memories, and deaths that still have no explanation. Project MKUltra. 3 syllables that sound almost harmless, like a lab experiment in some forgotten corner of science. But behind those letters lay a secret so deep that even presidents were barely told the truth. It was a program born out of fear, fed by ambition, and buried beneath decades of denial. A story that begins not with villains or heroes, but with ordinary men who believed they were serving their country. Do you think this experiment really ended, or just went underground? Tell me what you believe in the comments. The year was 1953. The world was split between 2 nuclear giants, each convinced the other had discovered the key to controlling the human mind. American soldiers returning from the Korean War spoke of comrades who had suddenly denounced their homeland on foreign radio stations, as if their thoughts had been rewritten. To Washington, it was proof that the Soviets and Chinese had cracked some terrible new code. The CIA decided it had to do the same, or risk falling behind in a war that wasn't fought with bullets, but with memories, hallucinations, and fear. Enter a chemist named Sidney Gottlieb. Quiet, intense, devoted, he was the kind of man who could mix lethal toxins in the morning and meditate on poetry at night. When the CIA asked for someone who could explore the limits of consciousness, Gottlieb didn't hesitate. He was given an unlimited budget, no congressional oversight, and one impossible mission: find a way to break a human being and rebuild them in any image the agency desired. They called it research, but what unfolded was closer to a nightmare stitched together by patriotism and paranoia. The first step was simple enough: chemicals. LSD had just been synthesized a few years earlier, and early reports claimed it could shatter reality like glass. What if, Gottlieb wondered, you could erase a man's memory, replace it with commands, and send him back into the world as a perfect tool? The idea of the Manchurian Candidate wasn't fiction to the CIA, it was a goal. So they began. University campuses, hospitals, prisons, and military bases became testing grounds. Sometimes volunteers were paid a few dollars. Other times, no one even knew they were part of an experiment. A prisoner might be told he was helping medical science. A student might be promised insight into creativity. They swallowed the pills, drank the cocktails, or inhaled the vapors, and reality began to melt. Some laughed for hours. Others screamed until they tore at their skin. The CIA recorded everything. In hidden rooms behind one-way mirrors, agents observed their subjects descend into madness. Every reaction was a data point. Every breakdown was progress. In a small Manhattan hotel, an operation codenamed Midnight Climax took the madness a step further. The agency rented apartments, filled them with hidden cameras, and hired prostitutes who lured unsuspecting men inside. The victims were drugged, observed, and cataloged like specimens. Behind the mirror, agents sipped martinis and took notes on how the human mind could be manipulated through fear, lust, and confusion. These were not villains in black capes. They were bureaucrats with clipboards, believing every shattered mind was a small price to pay for national security. One of the earliest casualties of MKUltra was one of their own. Dr. Frank Olson, a biochemist who began to doubt what they were doing. In November 1953, he attended a CIA retreat where he was secretly dosed with LSD. Days later, he plunged from the 10th floor of a New York hotel. Officially, it was suicide. Unofficially, his family spent decades fighting to prove he'd been silenced. When his body was exhumed in the 1990s, forensic evidence suggested he had been struck on the head before falling. No one was ever charged. The scandal almost surfaced then, but the Cold War swallowed it whole. America wanted to believe its protectors were still the good guys. So the documents were buried, the witnesses transferred, and the files stamped classified. Yet even destruction leaves shadows. Receipts, letters, fragments of reports survived in forgotten archives. Enough to suggest that MKUltra wasn't one project, but over 150 sub-projects. Everything from hypnosis and sensory deprivation to electroshock, isolation, and chemical lobotomy. At least 80 institutions, universities, hospitals, private labs, took part, often without knowing who was paying them. Professors thought they were studying memory. Doctors thought they were treating depression. Behind the funding fronts, the CIA was quietly rewriting what it meant to be human. The results were erratic. Some subjects broke completely, others seemed unaffected. But occasionally, the agency found something that terrified even them. A person so suggestible that, under hypnosis or drugs, they would obey any command, even violent ones, without memory afterward. In a few field tests, agents claimed to have sent such individuals on missions, though evidence remains murky. Still, the reports whispered through the halls of Langley. It worked. Meanwhile, Gottlieb's team kept pushing. They tested combinations of LSD, barbiturates, and electroshock, hoping to wipe the brain clean like a chalkboard. They called it de-patterning. Patients at mental hospitals, some merely suffering from anxiety, were subjected to hundreds of shocks and days of induced coma. When they awoke, they didn't remember their own names. To the CIA, that was proof of concept. To the families, it was lifelong tragedy. By 1960, the project's tentacles reached abroad. Experiments were conducted in Europe and Asia under friendly intelligence partnerships. Prisoners of war, refugees, and suspected spies became convenient material. Each success, each breakdown was filed under new code names: Artichoke, Bluebird, Derby Hat. And behind them all, the same invisible signature, MKUltra. But paranoia has an expiration date. As the 1960s shifted into chaos, Vietnam, protests, the hippie movement, LSD escaped the laboratory. What had been the CIA's secret weapon was now the drug of rebellion. The agency had created a monster it couldn't contain. When headlines began linking the counterculture to mind control experiments, the leadership panicked. By 1973, Director Richard Helms ordered all MKUltra files destroyed. He thought he was erasing history. He was wrong, because fragments remained, and fragments can still tell a story. By the time the Watergate scandal cracked Washington open, the ghosts of MKUltra were already restless. In 1974, a quiet journalist named Seymour Hersh published a small article in the New York Times hinting that the CIA had been experimenting on U.S. citizens without consent. It was a spark tossed into a dry forest. Within months, a Senate committee, led by Senator Frank Church, was hauling intelligence officials before the cameras. The public heard words they'd never imagined coming from men in suits: drugs, hypnosis, electroshock, memory erasure. When they asked to see the files, the agency claimed they were gone, destroyed, burned to ash. But history has a way of hiding in corners. In a forgotten warehouse, a bureaucrat found a set of financial records that had survived the purge. 20,000 pages of memos, invoices, and letters. They weren't the experiments themselves, but they were enough to outline the scope. Payments to universities, hospitals, and even private citizens. Code names like Subproject 68 and Operation Monarch. And that was when the word mind control entered mainstream America. The hearings were part horror show, part theater. Former patients described losing years of their lives in psychiatric wards where CIA funding had turned therapy rooms into laboratories. One woman spoke of being drugged for weeks, woken only for shock treatments that left her unable to remember her own children. Another claimed she was hypnotized until she believed she'd murdered someone, just to test how deep suggestion could go. The senators stared, speechless. But behind their polished questions was a deeper fear. What if it hadn't stopped? Because by then, the agency had already moved on. MKUltra may have died on paper, but its offspring lived on under new names: MK Search, MK Naomi, MK Delta. Each was narrower in scope, but the objective remained the same: control the human mind, predict behavior, manipulate memory. Then came the strange coincidences. In 1968, a young Marine named Robert F. Kennedy's assassin, Sirhan, was captured with a dazed expression and pages of hypnotic scribbles in his notebook. He later claimed he had no memory of firing the gun. Psychiatrists noted his trance-like state resembled subjects from CIA hypnosis reports. Was he a lone killer or an unwitting pawn? In 1978, the city of San Francisco reeled when Dan White, a clean-cut former policeman, walked into City Hall and murdered Mayor George Moscone and Supervisor Harvey Milk. During his trial, his defense described a sudden, uncharacteristic mental break. One witness whispered to a reporter, "He acted like someone flipped a switch." Those whispers never stopped. Because once you accept that a government agency spent 2 decades trying to erase and rewrite human will, every outburst of violence, every lone gunman, every inexplicable killing begins to look different. The pattern isn't proof, but it's enough to haunt. Meanwhile, something darker was happening outside the courtroom. The counterculture of the 1970s, hippies, cults, communes, was riddled with figures who seemed to echo MKUltra's experiments in control. Take Charles Manson. Before his followers carved terror into Los Angeles, Manson had spent years drifting in and out of federal custody. During those stints, he reportedly took part in psychological studies, some funded by agencies later linked to MKUltra subprojects. By the time he left prison, he was preaching manipulation and obedience as if he'd learned it from a manual. Coincidence, maybe, but once you start tracing the connections, coincidences begin to rot into patterns. There was also Jonestown. 900 people dead in a remote jungle in Guyana, all at the command of one man, Jim Jones. When investigators combed the camp, they found medical supplies, injection logs, and signs of chemical control. Some conspiracy researchers noticed that Jones' early church had received funding from groups connected to psychiatric experiments in the US. The parallels were impossible to ignore. Isolation, suggestion, drugging, and a mass death under total obedience. Was Jonestown a religious tragedy or a runaway experiment? No official report dared ask the question. By the 1980s, the CIA wanted MKUltra erased from public memory. But the damage was done. Hollywood turned the fragments into legend, The Manchurian Candidate, Jason Bourne, Stranger Things. Each retelling added a layer of myth, but the truth underneath was darker. Real people had been broken, and no one had ever been punished. Sidney Gottlieb retired quietly to a cabin in Virginia, where he raised goats and practiced meditation. He told friends he believed his work had been misunderstood. When a journalist once asked if he regretted anything, he smiled and said, "We were in a different world then." He died in 1999, taking most of the secrets with him. But pieces of those secrets keep resurfacing. Declassified memos from the 2010s revealed new code names, projects studying the use of brain stimulation, predictive algorithms, and emotional conditioning. Technology had advanced, but the goal was eerily familiar: influence without awareness. Think about it. In the 1950s, they needed LSD and electrodes. Today, all they need is data. Your phone tracks your habits, your fears, your desires. Algorithms predict what you'll click, what you'll buy, even what you'll believe. It's not mind control in the old sense, but the architecture is identical. Collect, condition, and control. And that's the uncomfortable bridge between MKUltra and modern life. The same psychological blueprints used to create assassins can be used to create obedient consumers, voters, or citizens without a single dose of LSD. The question isn't whether MKUltra ended. The question is what form it took next. Some former agents claimed the experiments continued under private contracts in biotech companies. Others suggested the research moved offshore, where legal oversight didn't exist. And then came a strange memo from 2003 buried deep in a Department of Defense release, mentioning a study on non-lethal behavioral modification. It used almost identical language to Gottlieb's proposals from 1953. Coincidence or continuity? Even now, whenever a lone attacker claims amnesia, whenever someone commits a crime they can't remember, the old ghosts return. Psychologists call it dissociation. Conspiracy theorists call it programming. But maybe it's both. Because MKUltra proved one thing beyond doubt. The mind can be split, rewritten, and rearranged. And if it was possible then, why not now, with technology 1,000 times more powerful? Sometimes the most dangerous secrets aren't buried. They're integrated, hidden in plain sight, disguised as progress. And that's where our story bends toward the present. When the church committee closed its hearings, they told Americans, this must never happen again. But they underestimated something. Once you discover how to bend the human mind, you never unlearn it. You just changed the tools. For a few quiet decades, those tools became invisible. Instead of syringes and electrodes, they came as signals, screens, and suggestions. Instead of a sterile laboratory, the experiment was moved into the living room, and we volunteered for it. Because that's what we do when something feels convenient. We trade privacy for comfort, attention for entertainment, and freedom for a sense of belonging. In the early 2000s, while the world was reeling from terrorism and war, intelligence agencies began exploring non-lethal warfare. The Pentagon called it cognitive influence operations. Psychologists rebranded it as nudging. Social media companies called it engagement optimization. Different names for the same principle. Guide thought, shape behavior, and make it look like choice. And as billions joined platforms, posting, clicking, scrolling, and reacting, a new kind of data goldmine emerged. Not about what people do, but about how people feel. Joy, anger, outrage, fear. Every tap and pause was mapped, recorded, fed into algorithms that learned not just what we liked, but how to move us. The same mechanics Gottlieb studied in his secret labs, only now perfected through machine learning. The irony? We built the cage ourselves, pixel by pixel. You can almost imagine the ghost of Gottlieb watching a TikTok feed flicker across a smartphone and whispering, "This is the real MKUltra." Because here's the unsettling truth. Back then, they could turn a soldier into a weapon by hijacking his mind. Now, they can turn millions of civilians into echo chambers, no hypnosis required. They don't need to erase memory. They just rewrite the feed. They don't need LSD to induce euphoria or paranoia. They just trigger dopamine loops with colors, sounds, and endless scrolls. And yet, the question remains, who's writing the script? In 2018, leaked documents from Cambridge Analytica revealed how psychological profiling was used to influence elections. They had analyzed personalities through Facebook likes, predicting who was anxious, angry, or susceptible to persuasion. They didn't need secret drugs or electrodes, just digital breadcrumbs. The same behavioral engineering once buried under MKUltra's codenames now drove marketing, politics, and even dating apps. Only now it was legal, even celebrated as innovation. What changed wasn't the goal. It was the branding. In a declassified CIA report from 1983 titled The Gateway Process, analysts described techniques to alter consciousness through sound frequencies and meditation to synchronize hemispheric brainwaves for higher states of awareness. It reads like science fiction, but it was real, and it suggests something chilling. Even after the MKUltra scandal, they never stopped exploring the limits of the mind. They just refined the language. Mind control became cognitive enhancement. Manipulation became behavioral modification. And the world, distracted by screens, barely noticed the shift. Because the greatest trick of all isn't erasing memories. It's convincing you nothing was erased. Consider this: every generation inherits the experiments of the last. The subjects of MKUltra were unwitting volunteers. But today, we sign the consent form ourselves. When we click, "I agree." We let devices listen, watch, and analyze us. We let apps anticipate our desires before we even name them. We let machines decide what's relevant, what's real, what's worth feeling. And in doing so, we've recreated the same dynamic the CIA once sought: control through invisible influence. But here's the twist. Maybe it's no longer about a single government, agency, or hidden lab. Maybe the experiment has outgrown its creators. Maybe the algorithm itself has become the new scientist, observing, testing, learning, and evolving from our responses. And that's what makes it unstoppable. When MKUltra began, the CIA had to find and manipulate a few hundred subjects. Now the modern machine can test billions, every hour, every click, every thought turned into data. We're no longer asking, can they control us? We're asking, can we even tell when they do? Imagine this. A man wakes up one morning, opens his phone, and scrolls through headlines. Each story confirms what he already believes. Each image deepens his outrage. By noon, he's furious at a world that feels hostile and broken. By evening, he's marching in a crowd of strangers who share the same anger, holding a sign that someone else designed. No one injected him with LSD. No one hypnotized him. But something in the invisible architecture of his digital world guided him there. Step by step, emotion by emotion. That's modern mind control, subtle, statistical, and scalable. The CIA once dreamed of turning men into programmable assassins. Today, technology can turn societies into programmable ideologies. Different method, same result. Behavior shaped from the shadows. And yet, there's hope. Because the same awareness that once exposed MKUltra can still break this new illusion. Knowledge is resistance. History is a mirror. And when we recognize the patterns, we begin to choose consciously again. In 1975, a senator asked a haunting question during the MKUltra hearings. If the human mind can be controlled without consent, is freedom still possible? Decades later, the question echoes louder than ever. Freedom, it seems, has never been about breaking chains. It's about knowing when you're wearing them. So the next time you hear someone dismiss MKUltra as a relic of the past, remember this: the files may have been burned, but the ideas survived. They evolved. They adapted. They turned invisible. And maybe, as you're watching this video, through an algorithm that predicted you'd click it, at a moment when your attention was most vulnerable, you're already inside the next phase of the experiment. Not as a subject in a chair, but as a participant in the feed. Because the real secret of the CIA files isn't what they did then. It's what they inspired now. The experiment never truly ended. It just got smarter. If you love uncovering the world's darkest secrets, don't forget to subscribe. I come bearing gifts every week. Next, watch my video. It's darker than you think.